The Honourable Member for Courtenay-Alberni.
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I'll be splitting my time with the member from Nunavut. Mr. Speaker, I'm speaking today from my home in the territory of the Nuu-chah-nulth people, just 25 kilometers from the territory of the Coast Salish people and the Qualicum First Nation. There are 10 First Nations communities in the riding of Courtenay-Alberni. And like most of you, I've spent the last week listening to the elected and hereditary leadership of these nations and their tribal council, and to listening to the words of residential school survivors and to the advice of the elders following the horrific revelations 1 week ago today on the grounds of the former Kamloops Indian Residential School. I join them all in sending my thoughts, prayers, and healing energy to the people of Kamloops, to Secwepemc Nation, and all of those survivors who attended this institution. I recognize the emotional and spiritual burden of searching for and finding the remains of these unnamed children, and I want to thank them all for their courage in doing so. There were four so-called Indian residential schools in Nuu-chah-nulth territory, and children were removed from their families and kept for 10 months or more each year, and others were sent to other territories, including to Kamloops, more than 500 kilometers away. Brothers were separated from sisters, and they were punished if they dared speak their mother language. As Canadians, we've long known this and about the unspeakable acts of cruelty, physical and sexual abuse inflicted upon the children in these places. Mr. Speaker, we've also known that many of the children didn't return. We knew this from their families, from survivors, and we knew this from the research conducted by the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. And as shocking as the revelation of last Thursday was for Canadians, it shouldn't come as a surprise. We've heard this. Survivors have always known. I want to thank the Kamloops, to Secwepemc Nation, and to the researchers who've carefully led us to these children. And I want to thank also the media for its care in routinely publishing the helpline for those who are triggered by reports of their findings, because they are. Chief Greg Louie, the elected chief of the Hausut First Nation, told me, quote, "With 2 residential schools in the Hausut territory, many children from other nations attended. Many didn't return for 10 months or return at all because of death. The atrocious treatment has caused generations of trauma. Please assist Hausut and all nations with appropriate resources to bring closure and healing to our people," end quote. And Chief Louie's words have been echoed by all the leaders with whom I've spoken with over the past week. Some have been more blunt, of course, and the time for words is past. Their people are in pain. They are losing survivors and the children and grandchildren to whom the pain of their trauma has been transferred, and they need closure and healing, as Chief Louie says. Vice President Mariah Charlson of the Nuu-chah-nulth Tribal Council said, "Though Canada's mandate to assimilate us all failed, the legacy is still alive in each of us. Let's commit to healing. I believe our land and teachings as Nuu-chah-nulth will be instrumental in this," end quote. And as this motion says, resources are required to support First Nations to do this work. In 1998, the Aboriginal Healing Foundation was established to provide Indigenous-led community-based programs for survivors and those who are affected by the intergenerational legacy of these schools, but it was cut by the Conservative government in 2010 and closed altogether in 2014. Nuu-chah-nulth children were removed from their families by missionaries beginning in the late 1800s. A practice that continued until the last school in Nuu-chah-nulth territory in 1983 was closed about 100 years later. The Healing Foundation and the communities it had funded had just over a decade to do the work of healing, clearly not nearly long enough. Now, the elected council and the Hawia, the hereditary leadership of the Sashat First Nation, continue to ask the Government of Canada to provide the necessary resources to remove the remaining buildings of the former Alberni Indian Residential School in its territory and build a healing and wellness center for survivors and the generations that have followed and have been impacted by a century of genocidal policies by Canada. At a community vigil this week, Mr. Speaker, elected Sashat councillor Ed Ross, he gathered the children around me so they could hear his words to me. And he had a message to send to Ottawa, and he wanted us to fight for this, that in the presence of the children, he said, if the government and the church could build a residential school here, they could also build a wellness center to help our people heal. He explained that they don't want to be known as the place that had a residential school that caused harm. They want it to be a place where they can reclaim their power. Chief Watts, Wamish, he reminded me that First Nations leaders believe the Prime Minister would implement all 94 calls to action of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. So far, they've only implemented 10. Chief Watts said the Prime Minister hasn't lived up to those commitments and needs to ensure all First Nations and Indigenous people are provided the necessary resources and information they need to do the important work in their communities to support healing. Mr. Speaker, resources for healing were paramount in the direction given to me by First Nations leaders, survivors, and elders. But the need for accountability was also emphasized. The president of the Nutala Tribal Council, Judith Sayre, said, quote, "It is important that light has been shed on this tragic truth that many have known for so long, that numerous of our loved ones never returned home from residential school. The reality is that the federal and religious may have wanted to silence these innocent children and forget about them, but these children can't be silenced no longer." Mr. Speaker, we can't expect First Nations and Indigenous people to resort to a GoFundMe like there's one in my writing right now, Mr. Speaker, to do the work, to find and identify the children who have been buried on these sites. This is the government's work, Mr. Speaker, to do that, to provide the resources. The Tribal Council is calling on the government to work with First Nations to discover the truth about other residential schools, using ground-penetrating radar to find out any other burial sites. We cannot rest until this is done, is what Dr. Sayre says. The government needs to stop fighting First Nations in court over their rights, whether the children for whom the Human Rights Tribunal has repeatedly ruled are entitled to care, or the fishers for whom the courts have are entitled to catch and sell fish within their territories. Part of the motion today, Mr. Speaker, and this government must call its lawyers off and stop wasting precious resources that can be redirected to reconciling historical wrongs. We're losing the survivors of these residential schools every day. The government must implement the calls to action of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission without further delay. They're important to healing within families and communities. They carry the truth of what happened in these schools, the source of trauma for their children, grandchildren, and children yet to be born. And I want to thank about so many who've contributed. Hereditary Chief McQuina, Chief Rakalma, Barney Williams, Moses Martin, Archie Little, Dolly McCrae, Cliff Atleo, Wickaninish, my own father, my adopted father from the Fisher River Cree Nation, for giving me sound advice and sharing. This motion is clear. I urge its unanimous approval. Cease the belligerent and litigious approach to justice for Indigenous people immediately. Find a just solution for the St. Anne's residential school survivors. Accelerate the implementation of the Truth and Reconciliation calls to action, and provide survivors and their families and their communities with appropriate resources to assist with emotional, physical, spiritual, mental, and cultural trauma resulting from these residential schools. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Questions and comments? Qu'est-ce commentaire? The Honourable Member for Timmins, James Bay.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I want to thank my honourable colleague. I have enormous respect for the passion and the work he's done in his region and with the Indigenous communities there. I'd like to ask him a question. We talk about intergenerational trauma. We talk about the crisis and the terror of mothers watching their children leave. But those children grow up to be mothers. And I'd like to ask him about what he's seen in his communities of the effects of those children raised in the residential schools who go on to raise families, having been pulled out of family and having been pulled out from the support and the teachings that make healthy families.
Member for Courtenay-Alberni.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And it is deeply personal. I just talked to my father, and his two older brothers went to residential school, and they never came back the same. And, you know, my grandma, my late grandmother, she every day she cried. She felt guilty. She felt responsible when it was the government who was responsible in inflicting the pain.
Questions and comments? The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary to the Minister of Crown Indigenous Relations.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I'd like to thank my friend and colleague for his comments, and I know this is a very difficult conversation for many, and I truly appreciate the depth of his commitment to the issues here. One of the things that Senator Sinclair outlined today in his opening remarks at the INN committee was the need to make this issue nonpartisan, to make it depoliticize it and work in collaboration. And I'm wondering if my friend could offer some suggestions as to how we can strengthen of all parties, of all the four parties that are represented in the House, in order to work collaboratively on this issue.
The Honourable Member for Courtenay-Alberni.
Well, I want to thank my colleague for the question. It's simple. Support the motion. Vote in solidarity for the motion. All parliamentarians need to get behind this motion because it directly gives action to the government. Stop litigating against Indigenous people. I think about my own riding, not just the children. You're fighting Indigenous, the New Charlotte. 3 upper court decisions, and the government has till the middle of June to decide whether they're going to fight them again. Specific claims tribunal decisions, the government appeals them. It's nonstop. Stop litigating against Indigenous people. Stop the violence. That's what has to happen. Vote for this motion. I urge you to have courage. I urge you to have courage. We need it. They need it. They need to see that you're behind reconciliation truly. It's time.
Questions and comments? The Honourable Member for Nanaimo Ladysmith.
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I would like to thank the honourable member, my neighbour and colleague, for his very heartfelt speech. And I hear you. I hear you. I have adoptive family who went through the residential school system, family friends who dealt with the abuse, and my father, who was a United Church minister, felt the guilt of the involvement of the church at the Alberni school and sat with Willie Blackwater through that case, the Arthur Plint case. And we need to take these things seriously. And I will support this motion. And I do recognize this as a genocide. And I thank you for your words. I thank you for your words and your commitment.
Honourable Member for Courtenay-Alberni.
Well, I really appreciate that, and I appreciate my friend and colleague for showing unified support, solidarity behind this motion, which needs to pass and then enacted by government. This is very difficult for a lot of people. They need to see action, but they need Parliament to be united in solidarity, that they're going to support this motion and stop the litigation and help those families heal. And I want to send my deepest healing and thoughts to my colleague and his family, because the intergenerational impacts is huge on everybody in these communities. And I cannot talk about some of the horrific things that were shared with me this week because it'll trigger people. But the pain is deep, and this is an opportunity for Canada to turn